I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And also recognise the amazing Aboriginal women who in the past, but even today, have shared their stories, their wisdom and also their generosity with us in this city. So a week, they say, is a long time in politics, and I think 3 weeks might be an eternity. And as I stand here, I recognise that because of the prevalence rates we know of sexual assault and sexual harassment, that the majority of women in our community may have been affected by the reporting we've seen. What I want to talk about now is about how long a year is. So celebrating International Women's Day 2021 with the theme of progressing women's empowerment and gender equality is as important as ever. As we've already heard, the World Economic Forum estimates that it will be 100 years before we reach gender equality, but I accept the challenge from UN Women that we need to make every day, week and year matter so that we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in 10 years. Now today, by coincidence, marks the 12-month anniversary since my report, Respect at Work, was tabled in Parliament, which set out the findings and recommendations from the Australian Human Rights Commission's 18-month sexual harassment inquiry that I conducted from 2018. Indeed, Kelly O'Dwyer, the Honourable Kelly O'Dwyer, who was Minister for Women at the time, was a key reason for that inquiry happening and was a key supporter behind it. This morning, exactly 12 months later, the government have announced, with cross-party support, a further inquiry into the experience in Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces with a focus on sexual assault, sexual harassment and bullying. Now, between those two moments, every single one of us have had an unimaginable year. So I want to talk to you about some of the notable things that have happened for Australian women over the last 12 months. I mentioned the 5th of March was when the report was tabled in Parliament, and on the 6th of March last year, I stood with the Honourable Marise Payne, now the Minister for Women, in Sydney to launch that report. Some of you will have attended with me on the 8th of March, the MCG, to see the amazing victory of the Australian women's cricket team in the T20 World Cup. Not only was that a victory, there was Katy Perry, and it also exceeded, it was the most watched women's sporting event in history with 1.1 billion viewers watching the event. I was then, in fact that night, to have flown to New York and Washington to share the outcomes of our report, and again, certainly some of you were heading to the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations. That was the first of a number of things that just fell out of my diary in the minute. And in fact, this event today is a good example of how much change we've had. I'm absolutely loving seeing Grace in Sydney, having people speaking here, and I hope we keep these things. So like all of you, I learned to pivot very quickly in March. I learnt to Zoom, I learnt to rearrange my bookshelves so the crappy crime books weren't there and the appropriate ones were behind me. I learnt to do interviews while watching my dogs out in the garden. I learnt to do innumerable speeches about that report. I learnt to encourage people to go on mute so we couldn't hear their dogs and their children, and then tell them to come off mute because they were still on mute. So we've all done that in the last 12 months, or at least those that are lucky enough to still have our jobs and to be safe and secure in our homes. The last 12 months has been a real-life demonstration that contradicts that saying, change takes time. In my roles, I am often encouraged that I need to be less impatient, that change takes time, and anyone who's heard me speak will know that I consistently say, no, change takes action, and usually people are not doing enough. I think the last year also showed us that change takes commitment and necessity sometimes, but that we absolutely can change faster than any of us imagined. So at the start, in March, I very quickly started working quite intensively with a group of women who all hold federal roles comparable to mine. So we used to catch up about every 6 months, although it would often extend out to 9 months. It was very hard to get together. They were Paddy Kinnersley, the head of Our Watch, the head of ANROS, it was the Ambassador for Women in STEM, the Ambassador for Gender Equality, the E-Safety Commissioner, the head of the Office for Women. All of us would get together and talk about things in relation to gender. But when COVID hit, we realised that there was a need for us rapidly to work together to identify the impacts on women and start really engaging and promoting change to make sure that women didn't fall behind. Because the reality is that the stereotype roles that men and women have in our community and in our homes meant that when COVID hit, and the particular way it hit, meant that it was in fact women who were at the most or disproportionately affected. So we identified a range of things, but there were 3 particular areas that we really focused on. First was looking at women in work. So because of the gender segregation of our workforce, we found that certain industries were particularly affected. Women are predominantly the majority of workers in the retail, hospitality, tourism sectors, and they lost their jobs quite dramatically and quite quickly. Women also much more likely to be part-time or casual workers, work less hours, and tended to be the ones who lost their hours. For the Melbourne people, you might have noticed on the 3rd of April there was a very big back-page picture with a picture of Brodie Grundy and his partner Rachel Wertheim. The headline was, "Star Magpie is the support act to the real hero." And it talked about Rachel's work as a health worker, but it really was quite disappointing to see the absolute sexism and the view as, can you believe a woman who's a health worker is more important than an AFL footballer? So the reality is our jobs changed, and I really would hope that our view now of women who are also at the forefront of essential work in the healthcare sector, being teachers, cleaners, those roles that we suddenly needed more than anything, those roles that are often paid less and have been valued less were suddenly the essential work. We saw that happen, but I'm a bit disillusioned that that won't convert in the recovery to a recognition of the value of those roles. Secondly, we identified that women at home were affected. I think government realised very quickly that when you make a stay-at-home order, given the real awareness of the experience of domestic and family violence, that ordering women to stay in their homes was perhaps ordering them to remain in the place that they were least safe. And so services were put in place pretty quickly, and there was a recognition that there might be some people where staying at home was not a good option. The other impact was as those of us who were at home suddenly, in Victoria at least, had our children at home with us for a significant amount of the year. Now, I will make a disclaimer that I don't fall into this category as someone who isn't the one who does the majority of the unpaid work in our house, but the stats showed us very quickly that while we know historically and across the board, women tend to do the majority of the unpaid care and unpaid domestic duties, when we were all home, we thought, well, great, the men are here, they'll start stepping up. But the stats showed us that that just amplified from both fronts. Yes, men did more of that unpaid work on average, but on average, women did significantly more. And that led to impacts on careers, that led to stress and mental health, and that led to women reducing their hours of work. And the other thing that we saw really quickly was the need for childcare. So the pandemic hit, and we realised if you want those essential workers, the health carers, the teachers, we needed childcare. We needed to be able to go out and attend work. And so we actually had a great social experiment with free childcare that showed us or reminded us that for both the welfare of kids but also the ability for people to take up work, childcare was required. And since then, there has been a much more active conversation about childhood and early care, looking at the welfare of children under 5, a really fascinating conversation that my colleague, the National Children's Commissioner, is engaged in, saying if we think the growth and development of children are important, why does government really only step in when they turn 5? So that conversation has happened as well. The other thing that was spotlighted, or really became apparent, I know to me, was that how much we rely on our political leaders when you have something as significant to all of us as that. National Cabinet convened quickly, and I was really grateful that there were female and male premiers at that table. We relied on their ability to use evidence, to collaborate, and to communicate. The University of Liverpool did some research last year and in August issued the findings that found of the 19 female leaders in the 149 countries studied, we find that female-led countries have significantly fewer deaths and also spread of COVID than countries led by men. Taiwan, Germany, New York, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, their results were really good. And I'm really proud that Australia's results were really good. And our position 12 months on, I think 12 months ago when people said this could go for 12 months, I just could not accept that. And also when people said this won't change until we have a vaccine, I thought that can't possibly be true. How different it is when we get to this moment. But I do remember in those starting early days that when I turned on my television, it was almost always at a federal level men that were talking to me, the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Health Minister, the Chief Medical Officer, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer were men. And they were making decisions for us all about our jobs, about where economic stimulus went, about childcare, about health matters, including women's health, about haircuts. And that really reminded me that women in political leadership should continue to be a priority, as well as in corporate and community leadership. But I will say there's been some bright spots over the last 12 months, and to some degree the frenzied discussion over the last 3 weeks, and particularly Janelle knows, these events have coincided with really good spotlighting and conversations about the issues that affect women in our country. So as I said, we've had good progress. The vaccine is being implemented. It's even less than 12 months since our first lockdown. There is heightened interest in combating sexual harassment, and the findings of the Respect at Work report, especially given the consistent spotlighting of sexual harassment through the High Court, through AMP, through the University of Adelaide and now through Parliament, have really kept the momentum going for corporates and organisations in addressing that prevalent issue. There's been bright spots for women's leadership, including the 4 remarkable women who were recognised as Australian of the Year. I was watching that and I didn't even dare to hope that all 4 of them would be women, because so often when I do things and I talk about gender equality, not everyone, some people are very quick to remind me not to forget the men, that it would be outrageous that this is something that would favour women. And those 4 women are remarkable, and I know you saw how remarkable Grace was, and in fact, Jamila as well. There are so many remarkable women that getting them into leadership roles and getting them on stages and hearing their voices is only going to make it all the better for us. Jamila mentioned as well the voice of Chantal Contis, who is the young woman who started the petition concerning the rate of sexual assault of schoolgirls, which has made education leaders listen and learn anew on this critical issue and take some action. And I guess I would have to say, and this is in yellow on my page because I didn't know whether that announcement would be made before this speech, but I guess the fact of our government, cross-party, being prepared to conduct an independent inquiry led by the Australian Human Rights Commission with all the protections that we have as an independent statutory authority that's governed by international principles for national human rights institutions, that actually, after a very sad period, is a really bright spot for a hope for a better future. So I thank you for your commitment to women, for attending today, and I reinforce the UN Women team's words. I hope this is only the first thing you do in the next month towards achieving gender equality in the next 10 years. Thank you.